The United Kingdom, and in particular Scotland, has amongst the highest drug death rates in Europe. 2,670 lives were lost in 2018 alone, a 17% increase from 2017, directly attributable to drug misuse, and many more are indirectly attributable to drug misuse. Every single one of those deaths was avoidable. 45% of acquisitive crime is committed by offenders who are regular users of heroin, cocaine, or crack cocaine. Yet, drug treatment services have faced funding cuts of 27% over the past 3 years alone, at a time when the costs of providing that treatment are rising. So, is the war on drugs lost? And what does lost mean in this context? And have we been asking the wrong question all along? And it is not a matter of criminal justice, but rather of health care. Should there still be a stigma attached to drug users? And I ask that question given that 8 contenders for the Conservative leadership in recent weeks have admitted to actually using prescribed drugs. We're in the midst of a general election which was not foreseen at the time that this forum was organized. But will any political party have the courage to decriminalize or regulate drug use? The Conservatives immediately rejected the recommendation of the House of Commons All-Party Committee on Healthcare on October 26th, which was to actually decriminalize the possession of drugs and instead step up healthcare treatment. Now, these questions are already widely debated, but what we have in our panel tonight are people who can actually provide a much deeper perspective on these issues. So, to my far left is Niamh Eastwood, who trained as a barrister. She is Executive Director of Release, which is the National Centre of Expertise on Drugs and Drugs Law. She has been working in drug policy for the past 15 years. And she advocates that the most vulnerable in society are disproportionately affected by the current drug laws. To my immediate left is Dr. Kojo, who is at the School of Law at Birkbeck College, and he works on issues of law, race, and empire, and is the author of The War on Drugs and the Global Color Line. And last, and only last because he's one of Wadham's own, is Maziyar Ghiabi, who is a lecturer in Iranian studies here in Wadham. And his first book is on drug politics, managing disorder in the Islamic Republic of Iran. And he has also edited a book on power and illicit drugs in the global south. So we actually are getting a global perspective tonight. And to start things off, I'm going to ask Kojo to speak for about 8 minutes, each speaker, and then we are going to leave lots of time for questions and engagement with the audience. Kojo.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for inviting me. Thank you all for taking the time to join us, to have this exciting discussion, late night discussion on drugs on Tuesday night at the university. Always fun. I think that what I want to kind of kick off the discussion by really emphasizing is a contextualization of our current approach towards drug policy. There is often an assumption that the approach that we have in the contemporary moment of responding to drugs that are deemed to be harmful by a system of legal prohibition by criminalization of the supply, the trade, of the possession of these drugs is the kind of norm and, has been the norm throughout time immemorial. The historian Roy Porter has a really incisive argument where he emphasizes how if you went back 200 years and asked people about the drug problem, about the notion of drugs, the notion of certain psychoactive substances being so addictive as to be able to precipitate social disorder, they have no idea what he meant. When we think about drug prohibition, we think about this idea of the war on drugs, we are really thinking of a 20th century invention, and you can trace that, especially when you start to look at the international laws and how they are actually signed and implemented. There's a fantastic part in John Stuart Mill's On Liberty where he's describing the attempt by the Qing dynasty in China to try and prohibit the trade of opium from the East India Company. He describes that early attempt at a kind of localized form of drug prohibition as being evil in and of itself, because it infringes upon the kind of free trade of British colonial commodities, of which opium was a key element, alongside the other psychoactive substances of sugar and tobacco and, rum, coffee, all of those stuff. It's fascinating to look at that in the middle of the 19th century and then to trace up to the implementation of the Sin Convention on Narcotic Drugs, the main treaty, the kind of is the bedrock for the current UN system of drug prohibition. And in that legal treaty, you actually have the trade of drugs being described as evil in the preamble. And it's one of the only examples of an issue that has been criminalized by international law being described as evil in the actual treaty of itself. And so we need to really think about how does that change occur and what does that open up in terms of the possibilities for other approaches to these issues outside of the simple prohibit and criminalize model that we've come to know. A little bit of history as to how we start to then get the architecture of international legislation on drug prohibition. We often might think of drug prohibition as being quite a marginal element of international law, or a marginal element of human rights. We might have a few international law scholars or human rights scholars in the audience today, and it's very likely that you'll go throughout an entire master's on international law without ever touching the issue of international drug prohibition. But in fact, the history shows us that it played quite a crucial role in the development of the institutionalization of international law, and particularly of the entry of the United States into the international legal community. It's actually with the campaign to try and prohibit the substances that we've now come to refer to as drugs that the United States really emerges as an international actor around the turn of the 20th century. This is all kind of the consequence of the conclusion of the Spanish-American War. At the conclusion of that, with the Treaty of Paris in 1898, America receives a plethora of protectorates. America doesn't like to call them colonies, so it calls them protectorates, Cuba, Guam, but most importantly, it receives the Philippines. And with the Philippines, it receives a kind of localized opium problem. And you then have the emergence, initially, through the kind of missionary class in the Philippines from the United States, people like Wilbur Diggs, people like Bishop Brent, who then actually sits as the chair of the first ever international conference on prohibiting drugs, the Shanghai Opium Commission. So you start off with the missionaries, and then you also get the diplomats and some of the major kind of international legal theorists who really established the discipline of international law within the American university. People like James Brown Scott, people like Ilya Root, some of the main doyens of international legal history in the United States of America take up the charge of drug prohibition as a vehicle through which America can kind of enter into the international community and really start to establish itself as a leader amongst its peers. Prior to that, America was a relatively protectionist country. We see that reinforced with the establishment of the League of Nations, where signatory to some of the early opium prohibitionist treaties become a mandatory element for membership of the League of Nations. And then we see that kind of most explicitly, we get the establishment of the United Nations, and we get the establishment of the first main international legal treaties that continue to kind of govern prohibition up until today. And we're thinking about the 61 Single Convention, we're thinking about the Psychotropic Treaty, and then we're thinking about the Treaty Against Trafficking as well in 1988. And so this is still the laws that facilitate a rather large global compliance with international drug prohibition, despite the plethora of different historical, anthropological, cultural, ritualistic uses of all these substances that are now prohibited. And when we then have a look at what the consequences of international drug prohibition have been, and we look at the consequences of these laws, we look at the harms that have been facilitated through the attempt at prohibition, whether we're talking about area fumigation policies across, the rural regions of Colombia and the Plan Colombian project, whether we're talking about the incredible death rate that occurs along the American-Mexican border in cities like Juarez through the Meridian Initiative, whether we're thinking about the kind of context that got me involved in drug policy, first of all, which is the kind of system of mass incarceration that's been erected in the United States and America. Huge mega prisons filled with young people, often people of colour, who are facing exorbitant prison sentences for being caught up in the prohibition of drug policy. We can start to see how a lot of the harms, how international drug prohibition, whilst not reducing a lot of the harms that we associate with drugs, and not reducing the trade of drugs, not reducing the levels of what people might refer to as drug addiction. Obviously that's a term we can complicate, and definitely not reducing as was mentioned in the introduction, some of the deaths that can result as a result of problematic substance use. They have led to a huge increase in a lot of other harms in terms of the harms of indigenous populations who've had to face the brunt of kind of crop eradication policies, in terms of the harms of urban impoverished communities who've had to face systems of police surveillance and mass incarceration. And so I think that when we first historicise the system that we have at the moment, and then we look at it on its own terms, in terms of what is the criteria that it is set for success, a quite explicit example is in 1998, the United Nations met in terms of the major conference on drug policy under the slogan, a drug-free world, we can do it. And so that's the criteria for success that we were establishing. People can let me know whether they think we've now achieved that drug-free world, or whether that's we're on the process of that, how close we are at it. I would say relatively unsuccessful. And so by its own criteria, it hasn't reached those levels of success. And then in terms of the harms that it might have implemented, I think we need to take those very, very seriously. And when you think about that as a historical project, I think it does open the door for exploring other alternatives, and hopefully some of my colleagues will speak about those in a little bit more depth. Thank you.
Very neatly wrapped up, and with quite a climax, a drug-free world. Mazi, over to you.
Thanks. So just to go on with what Kojo was saying, the drug prohibition is more or less an invention of the 20th century, or at least in its systematic way. But another concept that usually is connected immediately when we think about drugs is addiction. That's another invention of more or less of 19th century. If you look at the history, not only of the West, or North America, if you look at the history in global terms, addiction does not really appear in historical texts, in medical and biomedical research of scholars in the past. It's quite an invention that emerged with another idea that was very popular towards the end of the 19th century, which is that of freedom, liberty. In fact, the origin of the word addiction from the Latin addicere means to enslave, to make someone incapable of enjoying freedom. So I'll take a step back and sort of going into mythologies, and one of the first people from the West that traveled extensively across Asia was Marco Polo. He had some encounters also with drugs. Most notably, while he was in Iran, he met an old man, the old man of the mountain, who was part of an Ismaili Muslim sect, also known as hashishiya, which then was translated into assassins in Europe. Again, I mean, this small group, which, if you look at the historical kind of evidence, was actually opposing the central government at the time, and so was a political threat and a security threat to the caliphate of the time, was sort of described in terms where the drug was the big stigma. The militants of this sect were seen as totally sort of dependent on this drug and sort of doing things only because the drug would drive them to do so, and in order to have the pleasure, the initial pleasure of drug use. In a way, that Marco Polo's take has kind of remained with us throughout the ages, and quite actually interestingly, it ignores the sort of cultural value that drugs have had globally over centuries. And I'll kind of talk about this very quickly. So there is a lot of talk about medical cannabis today. You hear it in the UK, in North America, everywhere. But if you look at the Islamic civilization, medical cannabis existed already between the 9th and 10th century. A famous philosopher, physician, Ibn Sina, Avicenna, used to prescribe cannabis for various illnesses and sicknesses, including most sort of quite funny flatulence, epilepsy, migraine, and all other forms of, for instance, analgesic use that would kind of supplement the use of opium, another drug that was very much important for the pharmacopoeia of the time. It was the main painkiller before modern medicine. So again, medical cannabis existed already, and it suddenly kind of we forgot about it for 2 centuries, and then suddenly now it's coming back, mostly because of the great interest that pharmaceutical companies have for it, but also because of the total sort of insensitivity towards cannabis as a plant and its potentials. But another, even other models, if you look at more recent times, another substance, opioids, and opium in particular, this has been experimented outside Europe quite extensively. I'll take again another case from Iran. Between 1969 and 1979, so right after the revolution, Iran had implemented an extensive program of opium prescription through a medicalized model, where basically the cultural value of this substance was recognized and was prescribed for people who were aging, mostly over 50 years old. They would treat their back pain and other sorts of problems. And that was in response to a very modern epidemic, that of heroin, which had emerged by the influence of the global drug culture and particularly of pharmaceutical culture. We should remember that heroin is mostly a synthetic form of opioid, which was produced first in Germany at the end of the 19th century. So we do have medical models there. These are not, the product of our recent research, recent drug policy reform as originated in North America mostly and then in Europe. But another aspect which is key, and I kind of hinted at it already, is the way drugs actually occupy a very important place in other forms of sociality, rituality, and sort of self-therapy. In the Middle East, the use of hashish, which is the residue of cannabis, mixed with sort of sweets or with a yogurt drink, was very much used in rituals. One of them is called Dugh Wahdat, which is the sort of yogurt drink of unity, used very much to reach a higher status and sort of have a direct experience of the divine. And that was, and is, to some extent, it's very much in use. So in religious rituals, if you think about the Islamic world as a part of the world which we perceive as rather backwards, as a conservative, these kind of everyday experiences of drug use actually speak about another kind of sort of grassroots culture. Today, cannabis is illegal in most of the Middle East and most of the world, but actually it's very much used as forms of self-therapy or self-improvement. People use it to, for instance, relax, to treat pain despite the illegality, or to change their perception of cultural products such as music and arts. But they also do it in a way as a harm reduction approach, if you want to extend that. If you consider, for instance, and I'm again talking about Middle Eastern cases with which I'm most familiar, people who want to get off, for instance, an opioid dependence, opium or heroin, tend to shift in a very sort of course, remaining within the frame of illegality, to cannabis, which of course has fewer medical consequences on the body. And it's all, especially in recent years, more accepted. In a way, herbalists, also traditional healers, have also tended to prescribe it for people seeking alternative forms of treatment. Do you have 1 minute?
And you got 1 minute.
Okay. So again, I mean, this kind of examples, brought me to basically to rethink and to question actually what we mean by addiction itself. It's not only where is the place of drugs in our contemporary society, but can we understand addiction through other cultural frames, other forms of lived experience? It's a word very much abused, both in biomedicine, but also in the way we speak in advertisement. You'll notice, the great companies discussing, using addiction as a way of expressing utmost love for something. I'm totally addicted to Netflix, I'm totally addicted to Sky News or whatever. So this has become part of our way of interacting with things, the things of the world. So, I mean, as usual, as I do always in my lectures, I'm not actually giving a response, but just opening to other questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. So, well, we've had quite a tour d'horizon, both geographic and through time. I think we're landing back into the United Kingdom, well, the British Isles, with Niamh. So, Niamh, could you please provide us with your perspective on contemporary drug reform?
Yeah, thank you, Laura, and thanks for the invite this evening. So the premise is the war on drugs lost? Well, the war on drugs is not a war on drugs. Drugs are inanimate objects. It's a war on people, and that's what we have to remember. And it's actually a war on specific people. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the next few minutes. So, as Kojo has stated, the main aim of this war is to eliminate drug use, and that's been reiterated by successive UK governments in their drug strategy, where repeated Home Secretaries have stated that the purpose of the strategy is to suppress or eliminate the use of drugs in society. This is an impossible task. If we look at the statistics, it's estimated that last year 3.2 million people used an illicit substance. 3.2 million, that's 1 in 11 adults in the UK. When we look at the profile of people who use drugs, 90% of people use it recreationally. They face no real harms except for the fact that their drugs are adulterated because it's an illicit market and the risk of criminalisation. And we'll talk about that risk in a moment. The 10% of people who become dependent on drugs or addicted, a word we tend not to use because often it has pejorative implications for illicit drug users. But they mainly get dependent on drugs because of trauma. We provide legal services at my organisation for people who are living in poverty and who have a history of heroin and crack cocaine use. The stories I've heard over the years of people being abused as children, physically, sexually abused, who have been subject to abandonment, who have suffered from mental health issues, who are in a state of trauma, and they use drugs like heroin, which is used every day in hospitals across this country for physical pain to treat their emotional pain. It's a rational response. But then we look at who is criminalised. So drug use is ubiquitous in our society. As Laura has said, 8 Conservative leadership campaign candidates admitted to their Class A and Class B drug use. They weren't criminalised, and people from that background are very unlikely to be criminalised. Those who are the focus of policing are people of colour and people who are living in deprivation in this country. So my organisation has produced research along with LSE and Stopwatch, which is an organisation working on stop and search and effective policing. And what we found was that black people are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched for drugs, despite the fact that government statistics show black people use drugs at a lower rate than white people. They are less likely to commit this crime, yet they are more likely to be stopped and searched, arrested and prosecuted for the offence. We also find that black people were 12 times more likely to be prosecuted for cannabis possession. Just again, to state they use cannabis less than white people. White people like to cane it, black people don't. And this is important because when we have the debate about stop and search, we have to remember 60% of all stop and searches in this country are for drugs. They're not for knives. That's like 10 to 15%. This is an easy form of social control. It is easy for a police officer to say, I smell cannabis, and go after a young black man. As well as the racial profiling that we see in the statistics, we also see geographical profiling. So we were able to analyse the level of drugs policing in London, and it was the poorest areas of the capital that was subject to the highest level of police harassment. And just a reminder, most people who are stopped and searched for drugs don't have drugs on them. So this does not only affect people who use drugs, it affects populations in our towns and cities where it is used as a form to harass people. So that is a problem with our drug laws, and that is repeated across the globe. It's not just in the UK. Just quickly, I want to point to some of the most egregious things we're seeing at the moment. Kojo has mentioned mass incarceration. In the Philippines, Duterte, the president there, has declared a war on drugs. It is estimated that 27,000 people have been executed by police and vigilantes since June 2016. 27,000 people, mainly people who use drugs and low-level suppliers, and in many cases people who don't use drugs. Because this is an easy tool for politicians to go, look over there, this is our problem in society, it's not our problem, it's not our policies that are causing the harms to your communities. Loaura has also mentioned the drug-related deaths in this country. Nearly 3,000 people died in 2018 as a result of illicit drugs. 7 out of 10 of those people opiates were linked to those deaths, so drugs like heroin and methadone, and other opiates as well. In any other situation, this would be declared a public health crisis. More people are dying from drug-related deaths in this country than traffic fatalities. And yet this government does nothing, and that is because of the profile of people who are dying. These are poor people in poor communities who are unlikely to vote, and they simply do not care about them. They are expendable. That is what our drug policy does in this country. And the worst thing is that our government knows that our drug policy is an utter failure. There was a 2014 report from the Home Office that compared the experiences of countries across the globe, 14 countries. Some took a harsh approach, such as Japan and Sweden, where people are sent to prison for drug possession offences, and compared the experiences to countries like Portugal that ended criminal sanctions for possession offences back in 2001, and Uruguay, which has never criminalised possession of drugs. And what that report concluded was tough law enforcement has no impact on levels of use. There's a second report. There is a second report, which is an evaluation of our drug strategy, carried out again by the Home Office, which was published in 2017 and evaluated the 2010 drug strategy. My favourite chapter is Chapter 5, Law Enforcement. And it opens with, despite spending 1.6 billion a year on law enforcement in England and Wales, it has little to no impact on the availability of drugs. It describes the drugs market as resilient. So we have to question, if the government has this evidence that our drug policies don't work, why are they not willing to reform them? And I would argue that in some cases, drug policies do work. They work as a form of oppressing certain communities. They work as a form of racial oppression. They work as a form of marginalising already marginalised and vulnerable groups. And they work by othering specific groups in our society to detract people from the responsibility governments have towards them and their communities.
I must admit I'm quite shaken by the statistics which Niamh has given us. She's shown a very harsh light on the reality of the impact of our drug laws on British society today. Now we can open up the forum to discussion. We've actually got until 6:45, so we can keep going for quite a while. I have a student conscript to take the microphone to bring it to anyone in the audience who, so you just like to put up your hand.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, I just completely agree with everything you just said. I've been a Metropolitan Police officer for 2 years, and I'm currently here studying criminology. And I'd almost like to throw the question out to the panel that you ended with. Given there's so much evidence on how much harm there is and how it just seems like it's just so, everything's so wrong with it, looking at the evidence, why is policy not changing and what can we do about that?
I think, Niamh, would you like to start with that?
Yeah, fine.
And we'll pass it along to everyone here.
Due to time, I did leave out a note of how we do address this. But essentially, I do think this comes back to being treated as a third real issue, and that politicians are not willing to expend energy on it. And as I said, it does suit kind of political narratives around problems in society. A really good example of that is the serious violence strategy, which you'll be aware of. So the serious violence strategy was published a couple of years ago in response to knife crime, particularly in our cities. And it literally just blames the whole thing on the drugs trade. And I'm not saying the drugs trade is not a contributing factor, but it's more complex than that. It's about cuts to our youth services, it's cuts to police, it's cuts to all of these different things in society. Austerity is a huge factor in it, but much easier for government to go, oh, it's the Class A drugs trade that's causing it. So I think it is a useful tool for politicians. I do think things are changing though, and despite Brexit, the last 3 or 4 years has probably been the busiest in terms of political engagement around drugs policy. The SNP now support decriminalisation, the Greens support regulation of drugs and decriminalisation. The Labour Party has set up the Labour Drug Policy Reform Group, to which its basic premise is the war on drugs has failed, what is our response, and they're consulting across the country on that, so we're hopeful we'll get policy in the area. We do have backbench Tory MPs engaged. Front bench not so much, maybe they're just a bit embarrassed to meet with us. So I think we are seeing a shift, and as we get more and more evidence from jurisdictions across the globe, that's also helping to inform the debate. The one other thing I would mention is that we are seeing real police leadership in this area. So there are 5 areas of the country, which I can talk about later, that have implemented diversion programs for drug possession offences. And all of them now are operating what's called, or 4 are in operation, the 5th is about to come online in a couple of months. They will all be operating street diversion. So if someone is caught in possession of drugs, they will not be arrested, and they are not arrested, and they are diverted into what's called a drug education program, which is exactly like a speeding awareness course. It's 4 hours Saturday morning, chat about your drug use, end of. So we are seeing that innovation coming from police, and I think that will fundamentally change the debate here when we start to see more positive outcomes for individuals and better outcomes for police. So, yeah.
I believe that actually it's the Thames Valley Police
we work with
here in Oxford are involved in that.
Oh, they're brilliant. Jason
Safe diversion program. Yes, yes. They're actually, well, I must say they're moving much more to evidence-based policing than you see in other parts of the country. The Kojo, what do you think about that question?
I think, yeah, I would echo a lot of what Niamh just said in relationship to the kind of more aggressive stance that's being taken by law enforcement. For those who are interested, you might want to look at law enforcement against prohibition, LEAP, which is an organisation of active and former police officers. Jason Reed, fantastic advocate for that, who have seen the failings of this drug policy on the front line and are looking to advocate towards different types of reform. So you are seeing that from different kind of institutions around society, but yeah, in terms of the the current government in terms of the political class primarily, we are seeing still a little bit of inertia, or not a little bit of inertia, quite a lot of inertia. If we look at, the current government in terms of the Home Office, we are seeing again the weaponisation of kind of demonisation of language around drugs, specifically around county line, drug dealing by Priti Patel's Home Office, emphasising, we're going to have this kind of Harlem, county lines, Harlem drugs approach, which, yes, Niamh mentioned, has failed again and again and again, and I think that the reason why it can be used is absolutely because it functions as a useful tool towards facilitating social control, especially at a time of kind of disruption as we're seeing, both the Brexit moment and maybe what happens post-Brexit moment, it has been a fuel for law enforcement, authoritarian state control for a plethora of different governments around the world, and I don't think that's any different when we look in this example.
I hope I'm not abusing the position of the chair by just coming back on the county lines point, because what we see in criminal courts every day is our children who are being conscripted by drug traffickers into county lines, contrary to what you might think, it's not a question of someone going from Wiltshire into Oxfordshire. I mean, it's actually the use of telephones to use children to actually take drugs around pickups and deliveries and so forth. And actually, I think one thing we do have to recognize is that there is a lot of very serious criminality in which there is an exploitation of very vulnerable people to actually commit criminal offenses by the traffickers. How would you suggest that we deal with those, particularly because this is the county lines issue? I would have to say in my chambers, I don't think we had any instructions on county lines 5 or 6 years ago, and now everyone seems to be doing it.
So can I just come back on county lines, because I do think it's a really interesting discussion, county lines. And you're right, there are young people being exploited in the trade, and there is huge exploitation in this trade. No one is suggesting that organised crime that is involved in the drugs trade is a good thing. That's not a good thing. But what I think is interesting is we often have these drug scares. So both in terms of drugs themselves, but also in terms of developments in the drugs trade. And county lines, to some degree, is a construct of the National Crime Agency, which was largely driven by the telephone lines. You're absolutely right. So it's this move to the National Crime Agency could start to identify these lines. So they had the technology. We then also had the Modern Slavery Act come in. So this is a new piece of legislation that then can allow prosecutors, quite rightly, to bring additional charges of exploitation of children. But that then created a sense that this was a new phenomenon. And actually, I think it's a phenomenon that has been in part of the market, bar the technology, for a long, long time. Young black kids from London and young white kids from London, because I think one of the problems is county lines has been a very racialised construct as well. So it's been associated with people of colour rather than the reality, which is
it's much
white.
more complex.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's
And
just
so
children who are very often with no family support and
are they still being prosecuted?
They're trying to go after the traffickers instead and get them, but it is quite complex.
Yeah.
Yes, I don't think I can speak for the Crown Prosecution Service policy at the moment on this issue.
But it is interesting because it's again that kind of narrative of drug dealers exploiting children victims, but then a lot of the time these kids aren't being treated as victims, they're being treated as drug dealers. So it's just the complexity of this area and how we use different narratives to again go, look how dangerous this is, how bad this is, how we need to have a tough law enforcement approach rather than reflecting on why are we here.
Yeah. When we think about the current strategy that's being proposed through the Home Office in terms of the £20 million investment in anti-county lines program, a lot of that does seem to bring immediate contact with law enforcement to those kids who are being exploited. We're talking about kind of surveillance of police in terms of training, particular journeys, when we're thinking about who's actually going to be facing all of those consequences. You are talking about often those same children who, you're absolutely right, have been let down and are being exploited by an organised crime system that's taking the role that the community should be doing. And I think that that is perhaps where we should be thinking about putting our investment into youth services that have been cut, into early intervention programmes, into engagement at a school level that ensures that expulsion and diversion into pupil referral units isn't the immediate response to problematic children. I think that that would be a better use of our resources, as opposed to another ramping up of law enforcement on an anti-drugs kind of campaign.
Maziyar.
If I can add something, actually, not only talking about history, but from a very political science perspective, the issue of drugs and tough on crime generally, this is one of the reasons why it's so difficult, it's been so difficult to change, is that that's a taboo in elections. If at least it's been for quite a while, because no politician would dare to come up with a truly radical, and because a radical approach is what is needed here, in election times, but because of the accusation of being not tough on crime, and that's been quite, a sort of trope in politics in most countries. So there is a need for a public perception change, a change in public perception on the issue of illicit drugs first. Media have been very outspoken against, as we have just referred to, the county lines and the sort of drug scares and the moral panics around the substances. So we need also to have this kind of approach in which we reframe the whole phenomenon. We try to understand it differently, and we acknowledge also its of course its terrible impact on vulnerable communities, on actually all levels of the drug economy, from the trafficking dimension of it, and it's a global impact. It's not only in the UK. This has an impact from the country of production, from Afghanistan to Colombia, communities which experience both the damage of drug prohibition through securitization, so anti-narcotics policing, prison, but also the destruction of their economies, because drugs are actually a very sort of essential part of the economy in most of these countries. So we have to rethink about the drug economies locally, but also globally at the same time, because we may solve the problem for a few years here, but then this has an impact globally.
Let's turn it back to the audience then. There's a question at the back.
Just to build on Maziyar's point and to challenge the consensus, isn't decriminalization a halfway house and actually problematic if we look at regions of the world where production and trafficking and transshipment is the bigger problem? Because it's not completely outlandish to think that consumption rates might go up slightly, but if there's no legal way of accessing the substances, then that would create higher costs for countries in the global south, where drugs are produced and transshipped, if there's no also addressing the supply side.
Okay, I'm happy to do that. I do not see decriminalisation and regulation. So just to clarify for everybody, decriminalisation is the ending of criminal sanctions for personal use offences such as possession or cultivation of cannabis. It can be extended to other activities. So for example, we have a scheme up in Durham where we have people who are supplying drugs who are dependent themselves being diverted. It could also apply to farmers growing in Colombia, Peru, for example. But in practice, what we're looking at is mainly personal use offences. Then you have legalisation regulation, and that's where you have models like in the US and Canada around cannabis that provides a legal framework to produce, supply and purchase the drugs. So just to clarify that. I don't see those as competing policies. I think they are complementary policies. I think the reality is we are moving towards a regulatory market for cannabis in this country very quickly, and it will be 5 to 7 years before we get there. And that is not because of the reform movement and civil society organisations like mine. That is because lobbying and industry is here hard and fast and spending a lot of money to engage politicians. That will come. And then we need to talk about, well, what does that legalisation look like? And we're working on this. Because if we create a regulatory framework that seeks to only benefit industry, then the people that you're talking about are going to be equally damaged under that policy as they would be under decriminalisation. So I think the reality is we're going to have to move to a stage where we have incremental reform. Decriminalisation is part of that, so we start with possession offences, because again, we are very far away from a regulated cocaine or heroin market. But equally too, there is a risk that you could create regulated markets, as they did in Canada, where they regulated cannabis, but they created a whole swathe of new criminal laws which will impact the people who were impacted before. So it's not progressive social justice, racial justice reform, it is reform that benefits industry solely. And so I think when we talk about decriminalisation and regulation, we should do them in tandem with each other. We're not, as I say, going to get regulated market for certain drugs yet, so decriminalisation is a move towards that. But also when we get there, we need to look at the activities outside of the regulated market and say, let's stop criminalising people as we have historically done, because it will be people of colour and people living in poverty who will be the target of law enforcement once again, and we change nothing. That war will continue as it has done for the last century in terms of who is impacted. Does that make sense? So yeah, and 30 countries have decriminalised possession, and drug use did not go up. And Professor Alex Stevens has done an excellent review from Kent University that again shows liberalisation of our drug laws does not lead to an increase in consumption, at least under decriminalisation models.
Very interesting. Okay, more questions and comments? Yes, the back.
I could probably just speak loudly.
I think it would just still be best, at least for my sake.
Alright, I'm very good at these.
Hello.
So obviously there was the question of it being used as some sort of social tool, at least if you take the example of the UK and the US. I was wondering more on a global scale, I was thinking about this in Iran, in the running context. In terms of drugs being decriminalised, there are no aspect of other than sort of just simply being seen as something that's so inherently evil as to why, for instance, unlike Iranian laws and in the Middle East throughout, drugs are illegal in the same way they are in the UK and the US. Because as I remember watching this documentary, which focused more specifically on the legalization and sort of cracking down on communities, in particular music communities in the US, like jazz communities, how that was just another way of imprisoning black people, which was just horrible. I was just wondering, in an Iranian context, there might be a similar sort of story, I guess, towards Afghanis possibly, because I mean, that exists.
I mean, the Iranian context is not, it's quite telling. I usually say not only because I work on it, but I think it's quite telling because it's one of the countries with the highest number of drug users worldwide. The question of drugs is embedded historically and culturally in the country's modern life. I would say that actually, of course, you have to distinguish between the rhetoric that the Iranian state has adopted on it and the policies that it has adopted, the way it has practiced the law. Cannabis is tolerated, just like very little enforcement or no enforcement on cannabis, generally because we do have harder drugs, methamphetamine and heroin, and Iran experienced a heroin epidemic in the 90s and 2000s, particularly in the 2000s, which compelled the government to introduce extensive harm reduction policies, including needle exchange programs, methadone distribution, not for pockets of the population, nationwide, millions of people. Methadone is, I think for racial population, is the first worldwide for methadone. There is of course scapegoating on certain communities, Afghan migrants, which count 1.5 million in Iran, up to 2 million people, Baluchi community in the southwest, these are the most impoverished groups, of course, are target of anti-narcotic repression. Drugs are also, in part, not for all of them, a major source of revenue, given the fact that they don't have access to the legal economy. It's just the story is very similar to elsewhere, where drug prohibition actually has an impact on very vulnerable communities. And if I can add something on that, there is a structural dimension to drug policy, but drugs is not actually the problem. It's something else. drugs is used as either, a sort of easy lens to interpret the failures in welfare, in access to health, in access to economic opportunities for people. And because we cannot actually, or we are not ready to target and to tackle the real structural issues, such as redistribution of wealth and things like that, and we concentrate on drugs. It's much simpler. Just as a general point.
Just one thing to that as well. It just seems like if you look at this being this much of a Western construct as well, within especially post-revolutionary Iran, in some ways it feels like it wouldn't be surprising for Iranian policy, at least with regards to say marijuana and hashish, to sort of change in some sort of attempt at saying, well, sort of screw you, the West. Especially because I was under the impression that also laws were lax with regards to smoking marijuana in Iran because they just didn't know what the symptoms were. If someone's drunk, it's so bloody obvious, but if you're sort of smoking marijuana, your eyes might be a little bit red.
In a bit of self-promotion, I published an article called Islamic Cannabis, where I re-engaged with Iranian policymakers and religious authorities, and their response about cannabis, particularly medical cannabis, was positive in the sense that they had no objection to regulate medical cannabis, and therefore in a way to decriminalize cannabis overall. But not to legalize it in a monopoly, of course. Now, that's still contentious, because if the scientific evidence is that cannabis can be useful from a medical perspective or health perspective, then that shouldn't be a problem. Generally, I mean, now of course Iran is under international pressure, and that makes very difficult social reform because it's seen as a sort of concession to grassroots elements, and so. But in the midterm, my guess is that actually cannabis will be regulated in Iran. Opium tincture, which is the syrup taken from opium, is already legal and distributed as a medicine. So in a way, I mean, this is already underway.
So is it being regulated through a requirement for prescription, for example?
Yes, but it's very easy to get prescription because, you can just say that you are an opium abuser or a heroin abuser, and then you get a prescription of opium syrup.
One thing we haven't addressed is the use of opiates and if I recall correctly, the report from the House of Commons Committee expressed more concern about the use and abuse of prescription opiates than what we normally consider as being the baddies, so to speak. Any views on why this is happening? We have a black market in those in prescription drugs, but also we have GPs regularly prescribing them, and there's concern about the lack of control on that. And should there be more?
I suppose my only thing would be a cautionary tale from the US, where obviously we had hyper marketing of opiate drugs from Sackler families, Virgin Pharma, and I mean that was completely out of control, and that's partly to do with their health system, and obviously they are experiencing a crisis in terms of drug-related deaths. And with fentanyl now entering the market, although illicit fentanyl. But as a response to that, what happened was there was a tightening of the regulatory framework in terms of prescribing, to the point now there is actually a crisis in access to pain medication in some parts of the US. So in New York State, for example, where you could have got a prescription for a month, it's now being reduced to 3 days, and that's literally people being discharged from hospital. And if you don't live near the hospital and you're out in a rural community and you're having to travel in, so there's a balance to be got, and there's a responsibility obviously for prescribers and doctors to make sure they ensure that balance. I think it's also, I'm not going to diss opiates. They do have hugely effective pain relieving qualities, and again, it's important to remember that something like 80% of the world's opiates are consumed in 7 countries in the global north, and again, there is a crisis in access to pain medication, opiate pain medication in the global south. So I think there's a balance to be had, and some of that is having a better conversation with doctors, ensuring there is proper regulation, but not too tight regulation. It's just a difficult one.
Definitely agree with that, yes.
And it's not the drugs themselves, going back to what Mazzy said, that, you know, most people, you know, you look at the inequality in society, you look at things like trauma, all of these different things. These are the reasons people become dependent on drugs. It's the quality of our lives generally. And how do we address that? So, you know, some of the responses are, in terms of trauma, let's get trauma counsellors into schools at an early age. You know, let's provide those supports, let's deal with those issues early. In terms of inequality, let's start to talk about taxation and redistribution of wealth, and, you know, with proper social reforms and economic reforms. So, like, if we want to solve the drug problem, it's nothing to do with the drugs. It's a societal problem around how we manage our lives and allow, you know, huge inequities in our societies.
Those are all the gigantic questions.
Yes, they are. We should always ask the gigantic questions.
Does anyone in the audience feel sort of a tug in the contrary direction, that we do need still the criminal law to be regulating drug use, that we can't move toward deregulation, whatever form that should take? Is there a way of making the criminal law more effective?
We've convinced them all.
I think it's important. I mean, we all for regulation of some sort. It's no one actually saying deregulating. You know, liberalizing is deregulating. You know, sort of that you go to the supermarket and you just buy it in the supermarket shelf. You know, the regulation, there are different levels of regulation.
Of course,
you know?
yeah.
At the moment, it's actually to a certain extent not regulated because it's prohibited. And so if the legal market is unregulated, everyone can buy, everyone can, you know, either underage people or anything.
But you can get a prescription for methadone. You can get a prescription for an opiate.
But in terms of the prohibited substances, they are going through, whether we're thinking about in terms of the strength constituency of them, they're not going through any kind of regulatory checking model. Whether we're talking about the distribution of them, they're not going through any kind of regulatory checking model. They are essentially expelled from the kind of legal, regulated marketplace. And so opening up that debate and the different types of reform that we've explored over the course of this conversation. And I think that is something that's really encouraging, to just even accept the fact that the current system isn't doing what it says on the tin, it isn't meeting its own goals and sets by its own criteria, and therefore we need to explore the alternative models, which might be different according to different jurisdictions. But I think that starting from the position of recognising that the current system we have is actually an unregulated system for those substances that are prohibited by the actual law.
And I think we can also learn a lot from other jurisdictions in the world that have taken a tougher approach. You know, if you want to talk about the criminal law, and the purpose of it, as we've talked about, is to technically eliminate drug use. That's what they keep telling us. And we've got 33 countries that have the death penalty for drug offences, where people are executed. They're executing people every year. That drug trade is still happening, despite the threat of the death penalty. We have the US that has 25% of the world's prison population and 5% of the world's population. Much of that incarceration has been driven by drug offences, very low level offending, possession offences and low level supply. That is not a deterrent effect. We have in Brazil the cops going into favelas and shooting people dead. Again, the racial disparity in that is astounding. That is not stopping people from using drugs. Duterte's war on drugs, not stopping. Thailand carried out its war on drugs in 2003 and executed 3,000 people with a Kojo. You know, so these things are being done by governments. You know, people are being locked up in. I saw a video last week from Kenya. We had people over from Kenya. They have an issue with the illicit codeine market. If you were caught in possession of codeine, you were taken to a treatment centre. And the treatment centre is a so-called hospital in the middle of a remote area with the sun beating down. And there is all these pictures of people shackled to trees, manacles around their necks and their arms. That's not deterring people from using drugs. So how much do we need to do that deterrent effect? And why deter? You know, this again is a conversation we don't have. Yes, there are harms to drugs, but lots, like 3.2 million last year used drugs. there are actually very little harms. We overstate the harms of illicit substances because we have had a century of a propaganda campaign by governments across the globe that have told us, you try heroin once, you will be addicted. That's not true. 80% of people actually who use heroin do so in a manageable way. They go to work. Will Self did it. Lots of actors have done it. You know, there are people who talk about their opiate use. They're just so terrified to be open about it because of the stigma and the risk of criminalisation and the damage to reputation. So, you know, I think part of it is starting to explore why are we doing this, and do we need to do this, and are there benefits to society to say, you know, taking MDMA at the weekend might be quite a good idea.
That's on the record.
I'm happy to say that.
The irony is that there's a very high rate of drug use within prisons.
Yes.
And many inmates are actually introduced to drugs whilst in prison, and the drugs are adulterated and often highly dangerous. So prison doesn't work.
Absolutely.
To contradict the
And
previous Home Secretary.
But then it goes exactly back to that point. Why are people using, well, one, drugs are getting into prison, so, you know, but also two, why? Because it's an awful environment to be in. And if any of us were in that environment, we'd probably want to get off our cases. In the same way why we have a high level of use amongst the homeless population. That's an awful, awful, terrible situation to be in. These are rational responses to the way society is treating us.
Well, I think we've got time for just one more question from the audience. Yes, Edmund.
I'd like to pick up on that last point. So you've made very clear and convincing case that social deprivation, trauma really underlie problematic drug use. And yet, when we look at the pattern of drug use, for example, in this country, we see a regional distribution which has a certain pattern which cannot be explained solely in terms of deprivation or social inequality. And I'd like to invite you to suggest some of the other factors that may underlie why Scotland in particular in the UK currently seems to have such a particular problem. Is that to do with a specific policy in Scotland compared to other parts of the UK?
I think part of that is just sheer inequality, that trauma of poverty. And I don't want to say that drug dependency is solely an experience of those who live in poverty. I mean, it isn't. It's simply that is who we see coming into the treatment systems. If you have the resources, you will go to the Priory. We don't see you. You don't form part of those statistics. So in that sense, trauma is experienced across all socioeconomic groups, and so in the same way dependency is. But that trauma of poverty, that trauma of potentially having a less secure household, having high rates of use of alcohol, you know, those kind of, it's the adverse childhood experiences, and it's estimated if you have 2 to 3 to 4 adverse childhood experiences, it's 3 to 4 times more likely to become dependent on a substance, alcohol or illicit drug. Why it's particular to Scotland and why it's particular to Glasgow, because it's Dundee. If we look at kind of inequality and opportunities, I think that plays into it, but nobody has really got the silver bullet for that. That's the best I can answer you on that one, it really is. I wish I knew.
Well, we've had, I think, quite an extraordinary discussion. I would suggest one taking perspectives which were rarely, if ever, heard in the public discourse of the Daily Telegraph or the Daily Mail, and certainly we're not hearing it on the hustings in this election. But I think we can agree that these issues should be debated and should be on matters of political manifestos, because if we're going to be looking at all at evidence-led policy, surely the evidence is here for radical reform. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers for such an interesting contributions from their own research to this debate. And would you please join with me in thanking them?